Is why almost everyone talks about free will as being possibly in conflict with determinism, when it seems likely that determinism isn't true. So my question is, would we lose anything if we talked about mechanism instead of determinism? Right. So the mechanism being compatible with indeterminism, but it's, as I understand it, the idea that everything, including humans, is made out of parts, and it's the parts that not determine, but it's the parts that cause us to act in certain ways.
I think Hillary Bock's definition was that mechanism means that human actions are caused in the same way as everything else. And that could be, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Who uses that term? I mean, I know Bock and Scanlon does.
Scanlon, yeah. So there is this group who thinks that the
Dennis got a paper on called Mechanism of Responsibility.
That's where it comes from? I mean, has that how it worked into?
I think he might have done anyone else before.
Well, yeah, mechanism. But you know, then it points out, of course, that there are different levels of at which we might operate, and one level is a kind of purely physical level, but then there's a kind of program level, as it were, and then maybe an intentional level. And I don't think it's true that I think it's obviously false that human actions are caused in the same way as everything else is caused, because human actions are caused in part by desires and beliefs.
Yeah, you have to flesh it out a bit and say that if everything else is deterministic, human actions are deterministically caused. If everything else has a little bit of randomness in it, human beings have a little, or human actions have a little bit of randomness in the causation as well, and flesh it out like that. But then it could be useful to have a term then to describe all these possibilities.
But mechanism is consistent with the lack of determinism.
Yeah.
And some people, have argued, Tim Scanlon, Hillary Bock, others, that the real problem, or upon reflection, the problem that we should be focused on is the relationship between mechanism and freedom, rather than determinism and freedom. But I've never quite got that, or I've never quite understood. I mean, I do understand that if human actions were not caused by intentional states, or weren't, let's say, explained by intentional states. Let's say you have a non-causal theory of action, but you think, purposes are explanatory, and we act for reasons. I mean, if we didn't act for reasons, or if our behavior wasn't caused by reasons, then I wouldn't see how we could be responsible. I mean, that would be a real deep problem. But it seems to me fairly uncontroversial that we do act for reasons, and we do act for purposes, and a little more controversial, but still not terribly controversial, that those intentional states do cause our behavior. And so it would be straightforward then that our behavior is caused in a different way than the way that the movement of a billiard ball is caused by being hit by another billiard ball. Now, if mechanism is the thesis that all causation is just like the billiard ball causation, well, yeah, then mechanism would be a significant challenge, but I think it would be obviously false that human action is like that. I mean, what is the, yes, I think it's a significant problem if human action were not appropriately explained by mental states. I mean, is the idea, maybe are they saying that if a certain kind of reduction is true, like if somehow you could argue that even though there is a level of explanation at which we could explain human actions by purposes and desires and beliefs, still there is a deeper or more fundamental, the hegemonic basic level at which it's all just physical states that cause other physical states. That if that were true, then if that is what mechanism is, and if that were true, then that would challenge moral responsibility. Yep.
The addition to this question, I also think that it's not quite understandable for me why we're only mostly concentrated on the compatibility between the determinism and moral responsibility, where mental causation in general can pose a significant problem, and most theories imply that, as you just mentioned, that intentional states cause behavior, and that's already a questionable thesis, because if you take the thesis of main thesis of physicalism, that the physical world is closed, so that you take the physical closure and you also take the exclusion argument, you then end up with a question, how is that mental causation possible?
Yes.
And the second compatibility problem for me, I guess, is the personal identity. Given that a person is a set of, it seems to be a pattern of events, how you can have one event responsible for the other event in the past, that doesn't it doesn't come across to me as an easy, transparent solution. So why is that we are concentrated mostly on the determinism and not those issues?
Well, was the second issue...
So the first issue is mental causation.
Yeah, the second is...
And the second is the personal identity. And how are we, for instance, how can I be responsible for myself being 5 minutes ago? You have to solve the unity problem first.
How do you explain, right, okay. So, and Ben has written about some of these issues. In other words, are you saying that my moral responsibility for something I do now means that, my moral responsibility for what I did 5 minutes ago, if you say, you didn't make up your bed. If Tina comes and says, again, you didn't make up your bed, and I say, this isn't fair, you can't blame me, I'm not the same person. The presupposition is that there's personal identity, and unless we have a theory of personal identity,
yes.
Well, okay, but to that I would say first of all, I don't know. Matt and Ben have thought about this. Maybe.
But I think it's useful to separate out the issue.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I think normally people are concerned with, we talk about free will, you're thinking about moral responsibility at the time of action, when you perform the action. Whereas the other question, the second question you're interested in is sort of diachronic ownership, like what explains responsibility over time? So why am I responsible at T2 for something I did at T1? I think those questions are related, but it's useful to separate them out. So the traditional answer to the diachronic ownership thing is that you're the same person. And then, of course, you have to find out what's the true account of sameness of person. And I actually think that diachronic ownership isn't a matter of personal identity, but don't have to get into that now. But, I don't know if you need to, when you're worrying about free will, if you need to worry immediately about the sort of diachronic ownership question. But it certainly is relevant to questions of moral responsibility. But I'm really sort of just trying to explain how I think about it. It's just like how I kind of like separate the debates rather than really give you a sort of answer to your question. Does that help clarify it?
When we're talking, you're saying that when we're talking about moral responsibility, we're talking about the immediate. The responsibility for the immediate actions. Usually that doesn't really, in life, that really doesn't happen. But really, what the phenomenon we're describing is basically, you say somebody told lies to me, and then I find out in, let's say, in a day or 10, and then I feel resentment or I feel anger.
So I think usually sort of comprehensive account of moral responsibility will have to have conditions on diachronic ownership. So I think it's going to have to have something to do with the agent psychology at T2. So for example, say you do some action at T1 and it involved certain intentional states, and you might, this is not quite what I think, but it's fine for my purposes, that if those intentional states or any other states related to the action are still kind of present or still instantiated by the individual at the T2, then the individual at T2 can still be responsible for the action performed at T1. that leaves open the possibility that, say, for example, you do something really bad when you're 20 years old, and then like you're 90 years old and you've changed completely. We can still stipulate that you're numerically identical to your earlier self, but if you have developed your character in such a way, perhaps you had some sort of religious conversion or some sort of other conversion, atheistic conversion, you've just changed completely. I think it's plausible to say that you're no longer responsible for your earlier self.
Why would I have to change radically? For instance, I lied to you in a certain situation, and a moment later, I wouldn't want to really lie to you. I was like, I learned more about the situation, or maybe I gave it a more thoughtful, treatment and analysis, and then I wouldn't lie to you. So why would I now be responsible for my ignorance 5 seconds ago?
Yes.
It's very interesting.
Make a conjecture for it's an ad hoc conjecture for this case of personal identity in case of moral responsibility. Can't we say that you must be for some time you must be a person proper for application of an established set of reactive attitudes? I mean that if you were like a child 10 years ago and made harm, for example, to Ben, and then you changed, and you're not proper for this for application of the same reactive attitudes as a child 10 years ago. Now you are a proper candidate for application of different reactive attitudes. So it can be an excuse for not to be responsible
that's
now.
That's not really the problem, I think, because in this child example, you weren't morally responsible when you committed the act, and
but
then you became
let me finish. But if you did it 10 years ago when you were an adult, and as we could apply these attitudes 10 years ago to you, and now we can apply the same set of reactive attitudes to you, so we can.
Why is that?
Because
I didn't want to kill you.
No. Look, the set of reactive attitudes didn't change. So for like, if we regard you not like as Dmitry Volkov with your own thoughts, and we regard you as an object for reactive attitudes, and as an object for reactive attitudes, you are still the same, and it's not true like for.
You're just working out of inertia. You're slow. Okay. I've changed.
There is an idea that if, I guess the answer should depend on what we think moral responsibility is. If we think it is an attitude which is just there, which we really apply in our lives, then the answer should be very simple. We do believe that you are the same person. And by the way, if you change dramatically, and we know about that, we probably won't apply that attitude anymore. The first example I thought about was, legal. I know. Criminal punishment cannot be applied after a certain time, for different offenses, different time, but if someone stole something, then 20 years past he won't be responsible. But also that is possible in ordinary life. There was a person who did something for what we should morally blame him, but when we knew about that, already 100 years passed and he is already very, very old. And we think, it's not the same person anymore.
Is that what we think, or do we just... It seems to me that our reactive attitudes just kind of dissipate. We might think, he's morally responsible. I could blame him, but I don't feel like it. My emotions aren't engaged in the right way, but not because I think he's a different person, and not because I think he's excused. It's just that over time, I just lose interest in the sort of overt blaming responses.
Right.
That's how I would think of that. But
let's make this example more precise. You didn't know that he did what he did at that time. Oh, by the way, you will be very old too. All right. 50 years passed, and you know that he did that 50 years ago, and will you think he is morally responsible for that? He, who is now.
Yeah, I mean, if he had contracted, developed Alzheimer's or something like that, dementia, I might think he was different. But if he's had psychological continuity and no big breaks, just time,
If he,
I wouldn't think that diminishes moral responsibility. It might diminish my interest in engaging with him, but I would still judge it.
And there are the real-world cases that with the Nazis who, you know, Germans, for instance, now, there's a whole new group of prosecutors, a different generation, younger generation, who are now actively seeking out and, you know, searching these Nazis who have so far eluded apprehension, and they do have a strong interest in punishing these people who may have committed their crimes, 60 years ago? Yep.
And suppose you find such a person,
Yeah.
and he is mentally sick.
Is what?
Mentally sick. He's not a person anymore.
Oh, mentally
no,
ill. Okay.
All right. Let him
he
be
has
a person,
Alzheimer's.
but he has real problems.
Yeah.
Will you think he's still morally responsible? I believe you just said no, right?
Yeah, I would think not. I would say if I thought he was a different person, then I wouldn't think that he's responsible for the action committed by the previous person. I might think that he's no longer an apt target for a negative reactive attitude, so
Yeah.
blaming responses would be inappropriate. So, I mean, I could make this more precise, but let's just say no, not morally responsible.
That's it. It shows, as I believe, that the problem of identity is solved like that. If you still believe it's the same person, he is responsible. If you don't, you will not hold him responsible.
Well, I think the point is. Okay. Sophia's had her hands up for a while, so let me get to her and then
I thought someone should bring up Miller's manipulation cases, because he has this historical condition and he tries to support it with manipulation cases. Like he has this thought experiment with Charles Manson, and we just stipulate for the sake of argument that he fulfills all compatibilist conditions for moral responsibility, is rational and so on, and he is a horrible evil person. And then someone does something to him, and Miller calls it brainwashing, but it's described more like an act of magic. So basically he's turned good. And now he's a good person and does good deeds wholeheartedly and so on. And Miller's intuition is that he can't be morally responsible for his good deeds because they're a result of this intervention. And my intuition is that, yeah, he's morally responsible for his good deeds, but because of this radical change, I mean, really bam, from evil to good, and not because of some kind of psychological development, but because of some kind of intervention, this is a new moral agent. So good Charles Manson can be morally responsible for good Charles Manson's deed, but he's not morally responsible for evil Charles Manson's deed. And then the question is, of course, what does it take to be a new moral agent? And I don't have a precise answer to that. I think it definitely has to do with psychological continuity, not with biological continuity, and not any kind of psychological continuity, because we can easily imagine good Charles Manson having all bad Charles Manson's memories intact, but something that has to do with plans and how you appreciate reasons, your reason responsive mechanism perhaps, how intact that is, or I mean, what kind of continuity it is in that one. And if there's this radical break, you might say it's a new moral agent.
Artyom?
I think that your criteria of psychological continuity is not the main one, because the reactive attitudes are applied by us, not by the person, for example, the blamed person. And for us, it's like often not very interesting. What was the history of this person and so on. There may be some pieces of history, of personal history of this person that might change our attitude to her. But we are not generally interested in like. What this person likes, if he was.
But maybe it's because we don't in real life come across such dramatic changes as evil and good Charles Manson. If we did, I mean, I think my reaction to meeting good Charles Manson would be fairly different, because he's so he's so magical. I mean, so I wouldn't. I mean, in real life cases, there is usually enough of continuity to hold people responsible for what they did before. So these questions don't really pop up the way they do in thought experiments, I think.
Well, okay.
Oh, so maybe a worthwhile point is to point out that in real life we often don't know what people's, like, know directly what people's mental states are like. So it's often hard for us to judge that those people actually have changed. So the case of the Nazi war criminal is a good one because they did these really bad things in the 1940s, say in their 20s, and they get to 90 years old. Like, it might be that they've changed, but we kind of we might be a bit worried that they haven't changed. So we might be kind of just running on the assumption that they haven't changed, and that's kind of what makes us want to still, like, punish them for their actions.
They have changed, but they're not a different person. Suppose they just sincerely reject their old point of view. Does that, I mean, because you might say, well, they're still blameworthy for that action because at that time, but we don't want to blame them because, I don't think it's an excuse exactly, but there's something that sort of mollifies us because we know that now they accept our point of view about the iniquity of their past
I think it
actions.
has to depend on the details of the case and how that what the change actually involved.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering what's happening there. It's not an excuse, and it's not a justification for sure. And they're not a new person, but I do sort of have this sense that sometimes I'm less interested.
But could I add something? It wouldn't, I think, if someone had maybe a couple weeks after committing a terrible crime, a rape or a murder, had a genuine and sincere revelation that this was wrong and changed and would never do this again, I don't think that gets him off the hook at all. And so I'm not sure why it should matter that it takes place over time. But anyway.
Maybe we think they're punishing themselves. We say something like, she suffered enough already.
Maybe. Different senses of responsibility at play. So if we were thinking of the sort of basic desert sense, maybe they're not responsible in the basic desert sense, but maybe there's some other sense in which they're responsible. Maybe the answerability sense is that even though they might not deserve the reactive attitudes, they're still answerable for their crimes, and maybe that's underpinned. I mean, that's.
I think the problem with real life cases, if you make the case realistic, you have to imagine that this revelation or this epiphany comes from somewhere plausibly. I mean, even if God sent them a vision, they need to appreciate this vision. So it suggests some kind of continuity in their, to use your term just for the sake of argument, reason responsive mechanism. Maybe it's a slightly better term here. And then there is some kind of continuity in plausibly the same moral agent, although they have changed a lot. But my pretty firm intuition in Mealy's manipulation cases, where you really just lift out a bunch of values and replace them with new ones, is that moral responsibility don't carry over that process, but you can still have moral responsibility for new actions afterwards. And in the latter, I depart from Mealy, who thinks you can't.
And I see that. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, did you?
I was just going to say, one thing I'm concerned with is it's not exactly clear what the question on the table is, and so it seems like each person is responding to the previous person who's responding to the previous person, but there's not transitivity there, and that's fine. I mean, it's interesting, but I would like to maybe be clear about what the question is. One thing I'm finding is there's questions about whether we're inclined to judge people or to blame people, but then of course there's a question about whether it's even a separate question whether someone's blameworthy and whether we're inclined to blame. And also there's these other sort of two questions that seem to be related. One is the question of whether we're inclined to blame or whether we think someone is blameworthy after some manipulation has happened. And then there's a question about whether that's the same person and whether we would blame them or we think that they're blameworthy after the manipulation, assuming that they're the same person and then assuming that they're not the same person. So I guess, none of that is actually a stance on anything, but I guess I just want to be clear at each point, what is the question we're asking?
There's not one question. I mean, there are different issues that are coming up. But before we get any further, Anton, did you have some? No, okay, I thought you had. You should.
Yeah, so to get specific, one interesting question is with respect to a case in which, assuming we grant these assumptions, you have someone that committed a really terrible act, and then they're a much different person later on, but they're the same person. Would it matter if the way in which they were radically changed was a result that they wanted to get off the hook, so they go into this machine and push the button, and now they have completely different desires and values and so on, and let's assume it's still the same person, they're just very different. I just wonder what people's intuitions are in that case. If they're still blameworthy because they're the ones that they just want to get off the hook, and it seems like we can't just let them get off the hook by going to this machine.
I don't think it would matter. The
Yeah.
mechanism through which they became different wouldn't matter. But it's still an interesting question, right? Are they blameworthy? We might not want to blame them because they've disavowed, they're alienated now from their previous actions and previous motives, right? But that doesn't make them, they were responsible when they did it. So I think that's an interesting question, but the issue of the mechanism by which they changed, I don't think that would affect my decision.
Yeah, I'm sort of inclined to bite the bullet on that one too and say that, yeah, the person really got off the hook. I would still be super inclined to blame this person because it seems so much like cheating and because the person looks the same. So you want to blame the person, you want to blame someone, you don't want the person to have gotten off the hook.
But they're not blameworthy.
Yeah, but I'd still bite the bullet to say that no, this person is actually not really blameworthy, not if we completely replace these values in the machine. I mean, after a while, this might seem more natural when this person continues to be a really good person by hypothesis.
A hypothesis is a different person. What's that mean?
A different moral agent, but
Or a different moral agent. Yeah, no, that.
Maybe that is the same as a person, but it seems like I get into this quagmire, so I just say moral agent.
See, I think my own intuition is, I mean, if you're a different person in the metaphysical sense, right, then you're not morally responsible for what a different person did, and you can, as a new person, be held responsible for what you're doing after a certain time, maybe not immediately, but once you've taken responsibility for your mechanisms, in my view, in my theory. But there is this different idea that you have now you are the same metaphysical self, but you now have different values. You're a different moral person, I guess. And I don't share the view that, I mean, I don't think I share your intuitions about those cases different. I mean, I think your intuitions arguably are based on thinking of these individuals as different metaphysical persons, but when you substantially change the moral personality, it does seem, but with leaving the self intact, it does seem it's different from changing the self.
I don't really know what it means to leave or not leave the self intact while making a radical change in values and reason responsiveness and all that. So that's why I didn't want to say anything about it at all. Maybe the most plausible thing to say is that they're a different person.
Yeah.
But if someone comes along and say there are these really good arguments that personhood follows biology rather than psychology, then I would just go to that person. Yeah, okay, maybe, but biology can certainly not be what's morally relevant.
But arguably, personhood tracks. I mean, it's really hard. I'm not sure in the end what personhood tracks, but maybe memories. Maybe there's a psychological continuity theory, but it doesn't require sameness of values. I mean, you could have radically new values.
That to me seems to what's morally relevant. If there's this super sharp break in values and reason responsiveness, that seems to me to matter for moral responsibility, and maybe that also means you're a new person, but just leave the person afterwards.
I mean, I think Dimitri started this all off with his questions, and it's fine. And actually, I think someone said, maybe it was Ben, someone referred to a comprehensive theory of moral responsibility, and that's part of what I would say is that, right, a really comprehensive theory of all these matters would offer answers or seek to offer answers to these very difficult questions about when we are the same and when we're not the same person, and how personhood relates to the diachronic ownership condition or responsibility. Maybe that's not the basic issue, whether you have the same person. But even if it is, we'd have to have a theory of or an account of personal identity in order to have a really comprehensive and reductive theory. But at certain points in philosophy, I think we just pretty much have to focus in on some issues and leave some other issues to the side. And just so what I was doing is saying, well, assuming that we have some account of personal identity, or at least tolerably clear grasp of cases where you have the same person, then we can focus for a while on these other questions. But I agree, just by putting those questions aside for certain purposes doesn't make them go away intellectually, and to have a comprehensive theory, you would need something to say about that. And same thing about mental causation and the difficulties. The Kim-style arguments, according to which you might worry that we don't have mental causation. So, you know, ideally, we would have some way of responding to those arguments and establishing that, in fact, even in a materialistic and deterministic context, human beings as agents, our agents can act, which presumably means their behavior is caused, or at least explained, but let's say caused by mental states. Qua mental states, there is mental causation. But so a comprehensive theory of responsibility would have some response to Kim, and I agree, but those are significant questions. It's just that they're different questions from these questions about the relationship between determinism and responsibility, and I agree they would need to be, you would need some kind of answer to those worries, and I believe that there should be some answer, but I myself don't. I'm not a student of mental causation. Some of you are, and you might have views. But somebody told me who studies these things that, you know, Kim, though he's a very, very smart and good philosopher, there's reason to think that there is a response to some of his arguments. It's just not clear which one is the right one. I know Fritz Warfield thinks that there's a response, but in other words, I kind of put those aside to worry about other issues, but I agree that ultimately it would be desirable to have a response to those. But you can only do so much in philosophy. I mean, you can only, you know, I suppose if you really wanted let's say you're a determinist and a materialist, or at least you have a theory of moral responsibility which you claim is consistent with materialism, even if you're not committed to it. I suppose then, to make your theory really comprehensive, you would have to have some answer to the mind-body problem, according to which, you know, you explain how mental states can be physical states. But, you know, practically speaking, I just kind of assume, oh, well, there's some answer to that question, yeah, for this purpose. But, okay.
So I don't know if we want to continue
No, go.
this conversation about history, but I had a suggestion about, so one of the specific questions that I was interested in out of this conversation was how our reactive attitudes might change over time and what the cause of that is. So I suspect that we have a moral burden to not blame forever, that we ought to allow our negative reactive attitudes to dissipate, and we're being unreasonable if we persist in blame. And I suspect that's what explains why we tend not to blame people over the long run. Now, let's suppose that there was a Nazi who victimized somebody, did something terrible to somebody. And then much later in life, this Nazi's changed. He's not a different person, but he's rejected his past ways. He's sincerely repented and all that. I think it would be wrong to continue to blame him. But suppose that his victim, so here's a thought experiment, suppose that his victim was placed in suspended animation. So right after the point of victimization, when the guy was still a committed Nazi, placed in suspended animation, taken out of suspended animation 50 years later after the Nazi has sincerely repented. Now, would it be wrong for the victimizer who'd never gotten the chance to blame the person at that time? And I think that would be appropriate. I mean, I think the victim could say, he's a much better guy than he was, and that's good for him, but that doesn't wash away the wrong that he did to me, and I still have this authorization to have these negative reactive attitudes. Now, maybe in 50 years, I shouldn't have these attitudes because we also have a duty to allow these negative attitudes to dissipate. But so that's how I would answer some of the questions.
To comment on this, I think that after 50 years, we have good reasons to excuse this person, but but he or she is still morally responsible for his actions. But the reasons to excuse are overwhelming.
But not an excuse. So how do excuses function? Sometimes excuses function by showing that there was no ill will to begin with. Like, I bumped into you and it was an accident. So it's not that kind of excuse, but it's something else.
Kind of the time excuse. You say that, well, this is a white-headed, white-haired person who is ill, and well, I will not blame this person. I think that the considerations would be like this. This kind of excuse.
So I agree with actually what both of you said. And I think maybe it'd be helpful to talk about excuses in this one sense, where excuses are something like considerations or reasons that defeat, maybe the presumption of blameworthiness. This is what how Rosen talks about it. And then what Artem is talking about, or maybe further considerations that count against our blaming or the appropriateness of our blaming.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be helpful to distinguish blameworthiness, that is deserving blame or the desert of blame, in which I think in this case, maybe depending on the terminology, both of you would agree, it's still true that they deserve blame, but it might not be appropriate to blame them because of other considerations.
Right.
It might harm them, it might not be helpful because there's no need to deter them anymore. That sort of thing.
Right,
But the way that I was thinking about it is that talking about excuses probably isn't right, because excuses focus on the wrongdoer, and he's not exempt either. It's more about you as the blamer. There's a burden on you, and so there should be another word. I mean, it functions in a way kind of like an excuse, but it's substantively different. But I don't know how to describe
Yes,
that.
okay.
I guess it seems to work like that. It's not. I agree. It's not an excuse. Something what was called time excuse. It looks like because blaming someone is hurtful itself. Probably, if a person blames someone for a too long time, it would be more hurtful for him to blame someone that the original deed was. Maybe that's why people stop blaming in some time, and maybe that is why some deeds can never be excused in that way.
There's a kind of balance, and the hurt done by the blame is out of balance with the thing for which the person's being blamed, something like that.
Okay, you should.
Seems like there's a sense in which no matter how much time proceeds, as long as it's the same person, there's some sense in which the agent is always responsible for that action. I don't know what sense it is, because I don't want to say necessarily that suppose the action is wrong, so there was a time in which they're blameworthy. In some sense, they might no longer be blameworthy in the sense that they've, fulfilled their moral debt towards the person whom they've wronged, and so on. But it sounds kind of weird to say that they used to be just morally responsible, but now they're not. They're no longer morally responsible. So I'm not.
I think you might think of responsibility as being an appropriate target for the reactive, in the sense that not that all things considered you ought to apply a reactive attitude, but it wouldn't be out of bounds, or it wouldn't be a category mistake like it is to apply indignation to the lion. It's just inappropriate, or to resent this cup. It's just like not the kind of thing for which it's appropriate to have indignation or resentment. But in the case of, let's say, the Nazi who did these horrible things 60 years ago and has sincerely repented and has suffered, I'm inclined to say let's say it's a he is morally responsible for those actions. It would not be a category mistake to blame him, but it might be, all things considered, not the thing to do. And it might even be that he is blameworthy, but for some reason we think, again, all things considered, he ought not to be blamed. I'm not sure exactly how I think of it. I mean, I think the idea, it's interesting that Matt raised this idea that maybe the passage of time makes us feel that he's suffered enough, he's targeted himself, he's suffered enough. But I think what's interesting about blame, or one thing that's interesting about blame and punishment, is it's this interactive thing. And part of what's essential is that the blamer gets to blame. It's not just that you want the blamee to suffer, but you want closure doesn't occur until there is this interaction where the blamer gets the chance to blame. So you don't just look at the suffering. Something like this, now this is a kind of a inflammatory, or might be a controversial example just because of the nature of capital punishment or the death penalty. In the United States, we have capital punishment, maybe. Do you have it here in Russia as well? Or?
Punishment?
Yeah.
Actually,
Well, the last thing I heard about that is that we officially do have it, but do not use.
I see.
But it was some years ago, and I'm not sure about now.
Okay, so
I remember that some of the serial killers in 70s were in 70s or 80s were
In 90s also.
90s as well.
1994 Chikatilo was.
Oh, Chikatilo. Yeah.
but they had it then, they applied, they did have the death penalty then in the 90s, or not? I'm sorry, what were you saying? They did have, yeah.
In 90s.
Okay, well, so there have been cases in the United States, and what I want to say is I'm not here to defend the death penalty or anything, we'll leave that aside, but what was interesting is there have been cases in which people on death row have tried to kill themselves, and they're about to die, but the state intervenes to save them in order that they could put them to death later. And there is a point to that. I mean, I think what you see is it's not enough that the individual suffer and bring about his own death. The state has to do it because the state, there's some closure that can be achieved, if it can be achieved at all, only if the state gets to apply the punishment. And I think the same might be true about blaming. Like, if the Nazi blames himself terribly, still something's left out until the the victim gets to at least that's my intuition. Yeah, you should.
Just one more thing about that. That all sounds right to me. I think that there might be this other sense, again, in which an agent will always be responsible. And I guess when I think about that notion of moral responsibility, I'm thinking more in terms of an accountability sort of responsibility rather than a Straussonian kind. Like, there may come a point in which it's no longer appropriate to punish the person, to dissociate oneself from this person, or blame them in any sort of way, but there's always this thing that's going to be present with the...
So maybe this is a point that, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're invoking some kind of distinction, like Gary Watson's distinction between attributability and accountability, or that he thinks they're two faces of responsibility. And you might think the Nazi will always be attributably responsible, that those things are attributable in a deep way to him, but maybe he's not accountability responsible later. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the way you said accountable, but
yeah,
normally
I think
you'd say. I think what you wanted to say was attributable. They'll always be responsible for his behavior, but maybe punishment wouldn't be appropriate because he's not accountable.
My own intuition is he's accountability responsible, but that just is because I think of it as an aptness or openness to being a candidate for responsibility. But I think there's a separate question as to whether, all things considered, you ought to apply. Yes, Sophia.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could say something about mental causation again, or if we completely left that.
Wait, Joe, you want to follow up on this?
Yeah, precis.
Not to. One reason, just throwing out another explanation for why we might want to eventually stop blaming people is that stop blaming, even if we think they might still be attributable or blameworthy or something like that, is that so it might involve sometimes issues of luck or issues of sourcehood or something like that, where if you're a little bit skeptical about people ultimately being the source of their own actions, not being these self-created gods, if you will, that might sort of set the stakes for, or that might give us some reason for thinking that, yes, you can, so if I bump into you, yes, you might have some way of, some cause or some justification for resenting me for a while, expressing reactive attitudes. I might be an appropriate target for it. But it seems like it's some sort of mistake to resent me for, 5 years if I commit some small wrong towards you. And part of that might just come from contingencies of life, or maybe I should have been more wary but wasn't, and that was a mistake, but sort of just given these contingencies or something like that. Not to open up the question of luck, and I know we're trying to change that, but just sort of another possible explanation.
So is this like Oksana's point that there's the amount of blame should be proportionate to the badness of the harm, which I think was what you were suggesting? No?
Close to it.
Yeah.
Is that what?
And partly just sort of just the fact that it would be finite in general, even if it's a very, very large harm. Just part of maybe the reason why we want a finite amount of blame is just some of the contingency involved. That's not to say that the person isn't worthy of being blamed, but just sort of perhaps as a mitigating factor at some point.
What about the dead people? What about blaming the dead people? What is that? Like, are you blaming?
Yeah, that's a good issue.
Can we blame? I mean, it seems that we do blame and hold dead people accountable, and we have like investigations and what they did, and what. But how's that justified? There's no person.
I think this is somewhat parasitical on the praxis of holding living people morally responsible, I think. I mean, it's like if you hold a living person morally responsible in the bad sense, if you hold a living person blameworthy, even if you don't get a chance to blame that person, you at least have a preference for this person feeling bad and getting a bad conscience and so on, even if you don't get a chance to actually blame them. And I think if you hold a dead person morally responsible, you have some kind of preference. You would wish that this person would have suffered for what she did. It's too late to do anything about it now, obviously, but I think it's something like that.
What about the nations? Can you blame the nations as well?
Maybe only in a metaphorical sense, I think. In some details.
Well, I think that it's a question of temporal modality. For example, I say that Anton is like do something which can be blamed for, and I also can say that Anton did something, and it doesn't matter if he did it an hour ago, 10 years ago, and why it must matter if a person did it 1,000 years ago. A person did something blameworthy, and well, this action may be blamed. Well, don't you think so? We just change is to was, and yes.
I agree with Anton, but there is another idea. If moral responsibility is an attitude, well, we don't need a body to blame. We just think of someone. We could think of someone who is alive or not. It doesn't really matter, I think.
Right, I think that's what
We don't
we can
blame
think.
body. We blame person.
Right.
Yes.
Person is a fictional object.
But not the person himself, but what we think of him in sort of sense.
Yeah, can you blame a fictional character then? Would that be the same as a dead person? Not my question, that's it.
I can praise a fictional character who changed my life to better. Yes.
It's like an analogy of a real
Yes.
person, something.
I know we had discussions with Professor Howell about that. He didn't agree, but I'm not convinced.
Well, I think whether we can blame the dead in part depends on our theory of what blame is, but it does seem as though, just like we can think about dead people and they no longer exist, unless you have certain metaphysical views, like this eternalist picture where every entity, every time is equally real, and every entity is equally real or ontologically on a par in which you could target them. If you don't have that view, you could still presumably say we think about Aristotle, we think about Plato, or we can attribute properties to them, like Aristotle was, a pupil of Plato. He had that property, or Plato had the property of being a great philosopher. We can make these attributions even though they don't exist. So I think similarly, you should be able to blame someone who doesn't exist if they don't exist. But I don't know.
Yeah, the claim would be true. So I was thinking about what Oksana's view. So you have an attitude. You say, well, I'm having an attitude toward that person, but that person doesn't exist, so it's a problem. But you could say, as Artun was suggesting, well, I have this attitude that's based on the belief that this person did this objectionable action, and that's true.
Yeah.
So it's true about Plato, it's true about the Nazi, so you can blame them. But it's not true about the fictional character. The fictional character didn't really do that. So maybe that would be a way of explaining why you can't blame them.
Oh, I see.
Or your blame would always misfire.
But you do. I mean, but in
If you
general.
believe they don't exist.
Right. Let's say they don't. I mean, if you believe they do, then your blame is you think you're blaming them, but you're not.
Let's go. Okay. So, but yeah, the idea though, if blaming is having a certain attitude, we can certainly have attitudes toward individuals who don't exist, right? Different kinds of attitudes. I mean, we think Plato was a great philosopher. I'm having an attitude toward someone I know doesn't now exist, at least, yeah, assuming certain metaphysical
We're
beliefs.
also accepting a claim about them. And if the
Right.
claim is true, the claim can be true of a dead person.
Yes,
But it
yes.
wouldn't be true of a
That's the,
fiction.
okay, that's true. All right, so let's, okay, do you want to say something on mental causation?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely off topic with in relation to the current discussion, but we
Yes.
did talk about mental causation before.
it is a problem, it's a challenge.
Yeah, I'm going to use the paper here.
You can tear it off and make a new one.
Yeah, and I would need a pen too. I don't know what to do with this paper.
You can just put it in the corner, that's
Okay.
Or do it,
Okay. Yeah, because Ronald Dworkin claimed in Justice for Hedgehogs, you know, his latest book, I mean his last book. Ronald Dworkin, his last book, Justice for Hedgehogs, he writes a little bit about mental causation. He doesn't really think it's a problem because, okay, so basically the picture is this. Suppose that there are some situations, not all situations obviously, because we can act unthinkingly, but in some situations, like we have to make up our minds or something, and suppose that the mental is an epiphenomenon. So in some situations it's like this, and that here is the, obviously I couldn't just rub that off with my finger. So this is physical level and this is mental level. Okay, so it's like brain event A causes brain event B, and brain and bodily. Okay, the brain is in the body, but the rest of the body. Event C. And then as a sort of epiphenomenon here, there is thought about reasons, decision, and this can also be described as an intentional action. We would normally describe it as that. So the alternative to this would be like that I have other brain events, say brain event X, brain event Y, and this is just thinking about nothing in particular. Thinking nothing and just sitting still. So in a sense, it is still necessary for us to think about reasons and make decisions in these situations in order to act. Because there is no way we could cut out these, think about nothing, but still accomplish stuff. It's either this or this. So in a sense, it is still necessary that we think about reasons and make decisions in order to get things done, even though all the causation takes place down here, and these are just epiphenomena. So what Dworkin said was basically, if this is the case, if it works like this, then we're still justified in thinking about reasons and making decisions, and also evaluate our decisions, and then I think that praise and blame is some kind of decision evaluation, so it sort of conflates what Peerbohm calls holding people morally answerable and desert and all that. So yeah, basically it doesn't think it's a big problem with mental causation. So I was just wondering your thoughts about that. Yeah.
Just to clarify, what's the relationship between the stuff at the bottom and the stuff at the top? Is it identity of some kind? Is this emergence, of some kind? Is that some kind of property, different property?
He doesn't go into that. He just says, if this is the case, I don't even think he thinks this is a thought, because he's dead now, obviously. I don't think he thought this was a a plausible picture of how the body and mind works, etc. He just said if this is the case, some people think it would be a problem and we wouldn't really be agents, but he doesn't think it would be a problem. But since he doesn't really think this is all that plausible, he doesn't go into detail on how it would work really.
So this is a way of understanding the relationship between the brain and the mind, or brain states and mental states, such that you could still say the mind plays an important role, and thinking about reasons and making decisions play an important role, because our choices and actions and bodily movements are counterfactually dependent on these mental states.
Yeah, they're counterfactually dependent, right? But they're not really causally dependent. I think this presupposes that you understand causation in a non-Humean, like really strong way. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to say that these don't cause anything.
So, is this what you're thinking, that even if we didn't have mental causation, that is, causation by thoughts, qua thoughts, or mental states qua mental states, we could still have a responsibility. At least that's what, I mean, so I think there are different ways of going. You could try something like this, or you could try to defend the idea that there is mental causation against the Kim-style worries.
Because Kim seems to think that this would be really problematic. If it looked like this somehow, then we wouldn't really be agents. So it's important that it doesn't look like this, and that it's instead some kind of identity between. Away with this and call this a thought about reason. That's sort of the Kim thing, right? Yeah.
Couldn't you write the name of the author?
Yeah. And it's in Justice for Hedgehogs. He doesn't He doesn't express himself precisely in these terms, but this is what I got out of it anyway.
So you agreed that in a comprehensive account of moral responsibility, you'd have some answer for this problem. You'd either have to respond to the skeptical worries raised by Kim and others about possibility of mental causation in such a way that you make room for mental causation, or you'd have to say, even without mental causation, we could still have something strong enough to give us moral responsibility and a kind of agency. And I don't have, I mean, I've never really worked on this problem, so I don't really have an answer to these questions. I guess I agree that if there were no mental causation, that would be a big problem. If there couldn't be mental causation in a materialist world or a determinist world. So for Kim, I mean, Kim doesn't use determination as one of his, determinism as one of his assumptions that lead to the problem, does he? It's supposed to be a problem given materialism, right?
Yeah, the physical closure of the physical.
Closure, and the physicalism and the closure of the physical world.
Determination.
Okay.
And no
Yeah.
But it's not a problem, because if you think that the problem of moral causation is not a problem of interaction, so we don't have a problem with moral responsibility and problem of mental causation, because what the source of the problem of mental causation? So we believe that our mental life is deeply different from physical processes. That's why, and also we think that there is some relevance of our mental life to our behavior. Okay, so now as far as we know about philosophy of mind, the target issue is the phenomenal consciousness, and then Kim or another philosophers of consciousness try to describe mental causation. They understand about it just a possibility of phenomenal consciousness to be causally influential on behavior. But in that sense, we should recognize that beliefs, desires, or the rest dispositional attitudes have necessary relations with phenomenal consciousness. But if we don't believe that there is necessary relations between phenomenal consciousness and dispositional attitudes as beliefs and desires, so we don't care about mental causation, about the problem of mental causation as the problem of interaction, because beliefs and desires is just dispositional attitudes, and it's simple, because when we talk about persons, we don't understand under persons brain or physical structure, because as if I'm neuroscientist and I investigate how the brain works, so inside the brain there is nothing about personality, there is nothing about moral responsibility. So when we start to say something about moral responsibility, we start to regard the brain as a person, as something which have dispositional attitudes. And if we go otherwise to the brain, there is no issue for moral responsibility.
I'm not sure I got that. Okay, so, all right, what I was thinking the worry was that, because I know you work on mental causation, so maybe you could explain this to me. I think that we think that agency and action requires that my bodily movements be caused by my mental states, or at least explained in some way by my mental states. Or, if it's not a causal picture, at least I act for reasons and I act for purposes. So there has to be that kind of structure there in order for me even to act, and certainly for me to act intentionally, and for me to be morally responsible presupposes that I'm an agent in these basic ways. And now the worry is, if Kim makes certain assumptions, that the physical world, let's say if you assume that the mind is physical, or that we are physical creatures, and that there's closure of the physical world, causal closure of the physical world, then there's a non-overdetermination assumption. He then generates this idea that mental states can't cause behavior. Is that right?
It was just non-reductive physicalism. If we assume that, then the worry is then the mental isn't causally efficacious.
Right. Yes. Right. Well. Right. If If the mental is identical to the physical, then given that the physical causes our action, then the mental would. But yes, non-reductive physicalism, then now there's no place for the mind to be causing or be suitably related to our action. So what is the response that you were?
My idea is, for example, you are not physicalist, and you believe in, for example, property dualism. So, and as most philosophers, you take seriously a thesis of supervenience, and you believe in that supervenience is true. So, in that case, we still have the same problem of overdeterminism. And if we try to explain causal relevance of mental properties, as, for example, David Chalmers tries to do it, so we just need to show how mental properties can run some physical functions and so on. But the question about mental causation and moral responsibility, it's a question about causal relevance to behavior. And behavior, it's not a bunch or set of physical process. And if I somehow will show that mental properties can run physical functions, I will not have still an explanation of relevance of mental states to behavior.
Because
So-
you said behavior is not a bunch of physical properties, it's something.
No, just for example, when I raise my arm, there are many physical processes, and for example, some mental properties are responsible for some physical event. I don't know, for some neurotransmissions and so on, but not responsible for the whole motion, for the whole set of physical reactions and processes which we regard as a motion of my arm. So if I somehow show that physical properties are relevant to execution of physical processes, I still don't show that mental properties somehow execute behavior.
Because they won't explain all the physical processes?
Yeah.
Why is that? Why wouldn't, I mean, I know if they didn't, but is there some in principle reason that you can't explain all the physical processes in terms of mental processes?
Okay. I'm sorry. Maybe I tried to explain it on in another words. For example, we think that our behavior is a bunch of physical processes. Okay. And we believe that our mental life is relevant to this, to our behavior as a set of physical properties. But when I said behavior and physical processes, this is one case. But then I say that physical properties and behavior, this is another case. So if I show the case where I find a relevance of phenomenal properties to physical properties, I don't have a case where I have relevance that phenomenal properties to behavior.
Well, okay. So let me just ask simply, do you think that the problem of mental causation, as brought up, let's say, by Kim, do you think it is a decisive worry for a compatibilist theory of responsibility that could be a materialist? Or do you think that the problem can be solved or avoided by,
I just think if we don't confuse the problem of mental causation with the problem of interaction, so we don't care about the mental causation because there is no principal difficulties. We have principal difficulties only in a case when we identify the problem of mental causation with problem of interaction. But if we understand under the problem of mental causation just relevance of mental properties to behavior, so it's simple, because if you try to describe my behavior as a cognitive scientist or as another person, you don't have a chance to describe it by physical properties, you need to use dispositional attitudes as beliefs and so on.
I want to say that we started with the consequence
Yes, I want-
argument, and
We have a
then
few minutes. Let's get back to it if you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to say that I think that this problem of mental causation is a bit irrelevant to this issue of determinism. If you,
We're going back to mental causation.
it's what the consequence argument depends on according to. To your version, this depends on fixity of past and on fixity of laws of nature.
Yeah.
Look, let's imagine a deterministic picture of the universe. There is physical event 1, which leads according to law 1 to physical event 2. According to law 2, it leads to physical event 3. Let's imagine a non-deterministic universe. There is physical event 1, which leads to one. This thing leads to physical event 2, which can lead, according to one and the same law, to either P3 or P4. Assume that there are non-physical qualia that are responsible, that are causally responsible for physical events. So there is interaction between, like there is dualism is true, for example. See, then the question is, if there are fixed laws of nature. For example, we can say the physical event 1 leads to mental event, which according to the law of nature, still the law of nature 1, to this mental event, and according to the second law of nature leads to physical event 3. And this is a purely deterministic picture. So the physical and mental events and states are work according to deterministic laws. And we can also imagine a picture when they work like according to, it goes either to P3 or to P4. So what I want to say, what I want to show, that according that it doesn't matter if there is mental causation in any specific kind, because the argument depends on if there are fixed laws of nature and the supposition of fixity of past. Is it clear what I want to say, or is it a bit weird?
Okay, Joe, do you want to?
So I take it your point is that even if you allow for mental causation, the same problem might ultimately be that you might have physical laws, you might have mental laws that govern how mental causation works. So in the sense that, so I take it in the first case, you have a deterministic system where there's only physical things, and given the fixity of the past and the laws, you're guaranteed to get the outcome.
Yeah.
And if you believe in mental causation, you could still have a deterministic system where there are deterministic mental laws and deterministic physical laws. You have the past, and that will still lead to the same outcome necessarily, or deterministically. So even if you have mental causation, that alone doesn't get you off the hook from determinism.
That's what I want to say. Exactly. Too short. Thank you.
Oh no! I mean you do it out for me.
Yeah.
Another question. I guess you managed to show that if there is interaction, then it works. But could you please show what would be if there is no interaction?
Here is it. There are no mental events at all. So there are all physical events.
All right. Let's imagine first two cases are human behavior.
Well, yeah, that's what science says to us, that human behavior
But
is physical.
if so, wouldn't first two cases be different from third and fourth in the sense of moral responsibility?
Well, I want to show that no. Because look, the universe. We are talking not about like person, but the universe. The universe goes like a succession of states, and for the first state has a number of physical states, local physical states, and local mental states. Then it goes to the second station, which has several, again, physical states, several mental states, which are deterministic. So the steps from one to another, the steps from one stage to another are deterministic. They may be, or they may be. That's what the case is.
Well, I think, okay, we're almost out of time. So I think, bottom line for me, I'm not sure how to think of how to resolve or respond to the Kim-style exclusion argument exactly, and I'm not sure exactly how it relates to moral responsibility, but I do think you're right, Dmitry, that if you wanted a really thorough, complete account of responsibility, you'd have to address these issues. I mean, I'm not pessimistic about the possibility of addressing them. I think there are ways of, maybe the way Dworkin suggests, or maybe other ways of responding to Kim, but I do think, you would need such a thing. I was just kind of assuming that we do have mental causation and then saying, well, you could still have this problem, the problem that's raised by determinism and the consequence argument. Before we end, though, are there any, I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to ask any question about this morning's sessions, or if they were unclear, or if you have something you want to say about the consequence argument. Yes, Simon.
So it wasn't directly on the consequence argument, but it was on Lewis's approach, and you talked about how he starts with the counterfactuals,
yes,
and then moves to what we're able to do.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought that move could be illegitimate, in the sense that for him to judge whether a counterfactual is true, you're going to have to judge which worlds are close.
Yeah.
And you might think that to be able to make that judgment, you're going to have to know what abilities are had in each of the worlds. And then, so then it's just, he's got the order of explanation wrong, I guess.
Yeah. If that's right, if you're right that in order to ascertain which worlds are closest, you have to antecedently figure out whether I can do the thing in question, then right, there would be a fundamental problem with his theory. I think his presupposition is you could figure out the similarity relation among possible worlds apart from answering the question of whether the agent could have done otherwise. And I think that seems plausible to me. I mean, he gives, in various places, he kind of gives a general theory about similarity across possible worlds, and he just wants to apply it in this context. But I do agree that if you needed to figure out ability to do otherwise before you could fix the similarity structure, it would be a problem. It would be circular. I think it's really illuminating. I mean, the way see if I can express this well, but I think the way Van Inwagen approached things and the way many incompatibilists approach things, they ask questions like, can I break a physical law? Or can I change the past? And what that invites us, or kind of suggests, is that we should consider whether there's some conceptual truths about abilities or what I can do, such that perhaps I can't break those conceptual truths imply that I can't break a physical law or a law of nature, or I can't change the past. But it's as though can break a law or can change the past are kind of undivided locutions, or they're propositions, or they're phrases that can't be divided up. And what you're asking are whether there are conceptual truths that rule out, for instance, that I can change the past or I can violate a law. But on Lewis's way of thinking, and I think this is a more, in some ways, a more illuminating way to think, you actually first think about the counterfactuals and try and figure out, in a deterministic world, which counterfactuals are true. Then you ask what the relationship between those counterfactuals and can claims are. So at some point you are bringing in can or ability, but it's not in this, as it were, undivided, in the form of considering these propositions about relating can with breaking a law of nature. What you're now considering is whether you can do X, even if it's true that doing X would require the past to be different. Or another way of putting it is, let's say we assume determinism is true, and let's say Lewis is right that about the counterfactual. So we know in this context, if I were to do otherwise, the remote past would stay the same, but the immediate past would change, and there would be a different law than the total set of laws in the actual world. The total set would be different. At least one law would be different. Now the question Lewis asks is, given the truth of that counterfactual, does that show that I can't do the act in question? Now that still leaves room for the incompatibilist to say, well, yes, if that counterfactual is true, then that shows that you can't do the act. But it also leaves it open for a compatibilist to say, no, there is no conceptual link there. I don't know if that helps. I mean, it's a little bit, I don't think I put it quite the way I'd like, but I think it's legitimate to proceed in the way he does, where first you try and figure out the counterfactuals, then you try and figure out what the relationship between those counterfactuals and claims about can are. Any follow-ups? Yep.
I suppose the incompatibles could say to Lewis that even if he was right about that counterfactual, even if you could, in that sense, that still wouldn't be enough for, that's not the kind of can that you need for free will. You need the can that keeps the past and the laws just what they are in the actual world.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's going to be a debate, yes. I mean, I think that, in my view, again, there's no knockdown argument on either side. There are classical compatibilists. Lewis is one. Keith Lehrer is another who has a nice possible worlds account of freedom to do otherwise that's compatibilistic. And on his view, if I didn't raise my cup, but I could have raised my cup, that's true in virtue of there being a world accessible to this one in which I do raise my cup. But for him, worlds with a different past all the way back are accessible to this world. So again, it's a picture like we had before where you can jump to a world with a different past. And Lewis has arguments, Lehrer has arguments, other compatibilists have arguments for their view, and I don't think there is going to be a decisive argument one way or the other. Now, I don't think necessarily we should look for decisive, or we should expect decisive arguments in this realm. So maybe you could still proceed, but another approach is to say, okay, these are dialectical stalemates. There are strong considerations on each side, and nothing seems clearly to tip the balance. So let's look for let's take a different approach. And my different approach would be to say, we don't need freedom to do otherwise in order to be responsible. I mean, not everyone is going to agree with that, but that's what I think is a more productive avenue. Okay, I think it's 4. What we'll do is we'll start next time thinking about different strategies for different alternative strategies given the consequence argument. And the first one we'll look at is Peter Strawson's great, wonderful article. Let me just ask you, so I assume most of you have already read the Strawson article. So, okay, good. So what I will do, I will have a very brief summary, what I take to be some of the main points, and then we'll have a really robust discussion of it. And then in the afternoon, coming attraction, Matt Talbert will lead the discussion of Gary Watson's also really famous essay in which he develops some of Strawson's ideas and applies it to the psychopath, or possibly the psychopath, the serial killer in California. oh God, what was his name?
Robert Harris.
Robert Harris. I almost said Robert Miller. That's the editor I work with at Oxford University. I'm at that age. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I better not. Nobody tell Robert Miller that I almost conflated Robert Harris and Robert Miller. Just the names. Okay, well, thank you. I want to thank you for all your active participation. This is great, and I expect that we'll continue that. And in the, maybe today is not the best day for me to have individual sessions, but if later in the week you think you would like to have an individual session or a group session at the 4 o'clock hour, just let me know. Okay? All right. Thanks.